As parents, how worried should we be about sending kids back into the classroom? Marcelino Benito connects the dots on student safety.
As politicians and unions battle over reopening schools, most parents have one simple question: is it safe to send my kids to class? Unfortunately, the answer right now is maybe. Let's connect the dots. First things first, how vulnerable are children when it comes to coronavirus? We don't think they're in the same danger as adults. There have been a few studies looking at kids overseas that appear to show kids are less likely to contract COVID-19, and when they do, they usually have milder symptoms. There have been a few hundred cases of children suffering a severe inflammatory response after diagnosis, but most were treated successfully. The next question is, can students actually spread the virus? Right now, we don't have a good answer to that one. There has been some research, but not a lot, and the results have been mixed. A small study in China showed children had brought coronavirus home and infected family members, while another in France showed they did not. But that study in France looked at literally one infected child. If daycares and childcare centers are any indication, returning does carry some risk. In Texas, childcare facilities report over 1,600 cases. About a third of those are children, and the rest were staff. But the state is releasing few details about those cases. For instance, how many of those cases originated in the childcare centers. One thing is clear as parents make some tough decisions: we all need more information. Connecting the dots, I'm Marcelino Benito.